Hello everyone, in this video we will see user specific default constructor, compiler specific default constructor, why user specific default constructor is needed if compiler automatically generates default constructor. I have a class named A. For simplicity I have used A. You can define your own name. Let's look into user specific default constructor. The syntax for default constructor is class name which does not take any arguments. So default constructor is a constructor without any arguments or parameters. In other words, default constructor is a constructor with zero arguments. Now let's define this default constructor. I have a simple statement which prints default constructor. Now we will invoke this default constructor by creating an instance of this class. Class name space object name which does not pass any arguments. Let's try to run this program and see the output. If you see, user specific default constructor gets executed. Now we will move on to compiler specific default constructor. Compiler specific default constructor gets generated by the compiler only when there are no other constructors present within the class. Since we have a user defined default constructor, compiler will not generate default constructor for us. So let's comment this out. Now that the class A does not have any constructor present, compiler will generate default constructor for us. Let's run this program and check the output. If you see, we do not see any error. This is because during object creation, a compiler generated default constructor gets invoked. Because of this, we don't see any errors. Now instead of uncommitting the default constructor, let's create a parameterized constructor. Class name which takes some parameter. Now let's run this program and check the output. If you see, we got an error saying no matching function for call to default constructor. This is because whenever any user defined constructor exists within the class, compiler will not generate default constructor. Now let's comment this out and try to create copy constructor. Let's run this program and check the output. If you see, we got a same error saying no matching function for call to default constructor. The reason is same, since we have a constructor defined by the user, compiler will not generate default constructor. Because of this, we are seeing this error. Let's comment out all the user specific constructors and check the output again. If you see, the program is compiled and run successfully without any errors. Now that we understand what is user specific default constructor and compiler specific default constructor, let's look into the last topic. Why do we need to define default constructor if compiler itself generate default constructor for us? To explain this, I will create a member variable for this class. Let's print this member variable. If you see, we do not have any constructor present within the class, so compiler will generate default constructor for us. Let's try to run this program and check the output. If you see the output, some random value is printed for the variable x. This is because compiler generated default constructor have an empty body which does not initialize any member variables. Now let's uncomment user defined default constructor and initialize the variable x with some value. Let's run this program and check the output. If you see, default constructor gets executed and member variables gets initialized with 5. So whenever we need to initialize the member variables to some values, we can define our own default constructor instead of depending on the compiler generated constructor. Let's summarize the discussions. So default constructor is a constructor which does not take any arguments or parameters. Default constructor gets generated by the compiler only when there is no user specific constructor. This includes default constructor, parameterized constructor, and copy constructor. If a class has any of these three, either default or parameterized or copy constructor, compiler will not generate default constructor for us. That's all I have for this video. Let me know what you think about this video in the comment section below. If you like this video, please give a thumbs up. To see more videos like this in the future, please subscribe to my channel. Thanks a lot for watching.